Welcome to Kainos. The conversation you are about to see explores one of the deepest questions we can ask, which is, what is real? Philosophers have been debating that question for tens of thousands of years, maybe. But in the West, over the last 400 years or so, there's been a dominant answer, which is that what's real is what we can measure and calculate. So that means that all that really matters is matter. Your consciousness, so what's actually perceiving these things, is a byproduct of the matter in your brain, and therefore not really real, or at least not as real as things. But does that actually make sense? Is your experience of watching this right now any less real than your phone or your laptop? And how could you prove it? So to explore these questions, I had a conversation with Dr. Matthew Segall, who's a transdisciplinary philosopher and associate professor in the philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness program at CIIS. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Great. So Matt, welcome.
Good to see you, Ali.
You too. So we were just talking before we started recording about your fairly busy travel schedule recently, and the fact that you've been to many conferences talking about you are an academic and a philosopher. So I presume you were mainly talking philosophy. I'll just double check that before.
Yeah, philosophy of biology and parapsychology, plasma cosmology. It was a bit all over the place, but that's the transdisciplinary aspect of what I do, I guess. So,
yeah. I'm definitely going to put a flag in plasma cosmology to come back to because I'm quite curious. But one of the things I thought we could start off with is to get your opinion on whether there is a shift happening, maybe in academia, maybe more broadly, away from the existing paradigm we have about what reality is, which you could say broadly would be physicalism or materialism, that what's most real is matter, towards more positions that include or are sometimes entirely centered around consciousness or mind. Do you think there's a movement happening at the moment? Do you think there's more openness toward those other positions?
I think so. I don't have the survey data at hand to really know what's going on inside academia, though I feel like my thermometer would suggest that materialism, physicalism, sort of default atheistic secular orientation is thawing, and that's making room for a whole variety of alternatives to physicalism. Panpsychism and idealism can be defined in a variety of ways, but I think those two general categories seem to capture a lot of the direction that I see opening up for what might become a new paradigm. I don't know that there's been, while I think physicalism is waning, and it's certainly over in terms of having sway over the general public, but also within academia, I don't know that there's yet a sort of crystallized consensus about what the alternative might be. It's a very exciting time, and as you lay out in your book, there's sort of my approach to kind of process panpsychism, but then there's also like Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism, and it's not always clear where we overlap and where we differ, but I think there's a lot of different options on the table, and so it's a really exciting time, very exploratory time. It's almost like, we discovered the map isn't flat, or the Earth isn't flat, and that we need to adjust our map. I like to imagine that we're on the verge of a transformation really in cosmology that's no less dramatic than the Copernican heliocentric revolution, right? The shift out of this closed universe that Ptolemy was imagining and Aristotle was imagining into this idea of, the Earth's not at the still center of the universe. Whatever's next, I think, will be just as much a dramatic reorientation that will have scientific implications, but also it'll be a tremendous cultural reorientation at the level of worldview. So how soon we could see that occurring? I mean, we seem to be right in the chaotic, frothy middle of that transformation right now. So
Yeah, and which might be why it feels like, on the cultural level, as well as maybe the deeper spiritual levels, it's a chaotic time, and there's an uncertainty, and it's, a lot of people, myself included, have described it as a liminal time, sort of a time between worlds. I certainly feel that at the moment, and I'm really interested in, and I've written about this a bunch, including in my book, like what it means for our cultural value system to have a different idea about what is real. For me, that's fundamental. If what we believe is real, I think, not entirely, but I think has a massive impact on how culture forms and what we value and how we behave, the norms, the rituals we create. This is quite speculative, but in your imaginings, what would you hope for in a world that moves away from physicalism or materialism towards something that includes mind more fully?
Well, I think the danger right now is that because we're in this interim period and there's no clear cosmological container for us, a shelter for us to step into. The risk is that we sort of fall to the lowest common denominator as the source of our values, and I think that lowest common denominator is what we could call the cosmology of the market, where the one value that everyone can and kind of has to agree on is money, because you can't live without it. Almost every human interaction is mediated by this symbolic substance we call money. And it's not that money is intrinsically evil or anything. It's just that when there's no higher order set of cultural and cultural values and cosmological meaning, it's very easy to just drop down into this basically survival of the fittest competitive dynamic, where everything becomes an acquisitive strategy, and how to one up everyone else in a logic of exchange, where I'm only going to do something if there's something in it for me. And so what starts to break down, I think, in that, it's a more or less materialistic picture, or at best a kind of not so much Darwinian. I think Darwin was a bit more complex than this, but Herbert Spencer, who turned a Darwinian picture of evolution into a social philosophy, where it really is survival of the fittest, right? And where fitness gets read not as like fitting into a niche, but being the strongest and most powerful and so on. That sort of default market cosmology is very materialistic. It's very, it reduces human beings to just selfish, competing animals in a fixed environment of scarce resources. And so the danger is we don't transition fast enough into a cosmology of, I would say, surplus, in the sense that it's surplus meaning, surplus value, and the real challenge is not, oh, there's not enough to go around. The real challenge is one of distribution, and how we arrive at a cultural system of shared value that allows us to, as human beings, really have our virtues mirrored back to us and not just our vices, right? And so this default market cosmology really encourages us to believe that we are just selfish actors. It emphasizes our vices rather than allowing us to cultivate our potential virtues. If we had a cosmology that reflected back to us a universe and an evolutionary process that was just as much about symbiogenesis and cooperative creation of new value as it was about sort of trying to retain the value we think we already have and selfishly hoard more and more of it, then we'd have it'd be a totally the basis for a totally new kind of civilization. And so we have an economy, we have a government, state institutions that I think are running on the fumes of this modern, more or less scientific materialist picture, a mechanistic picture both of nature and of society that science has moved beyond in many ways, and the culture wants to move beyond, but it's like we don't yet fully have, like, we don't believe in the old cosmology, but we don't have a new one to really believe in yet either. And so we default to this lowest common denominator of market value, right? And so capitalism is very happy to fill the void in the midst of this meaning crisis. And so it is pretty urgent for us to concretize what this alternative cosmological view would be. But I also don't want to rush because, as soon as one of the contenders captures that flag, then all of a sudden there's in a way, a new sheriff in town, and we don't want to become suffocated by a new kind of ideological enclosure, just because, it's so dangerous to remain in this space of uncertainty, given the temptation of the market cosmology that's available. So I don't know. It's a tentative time. Like I obviously have my preferences about the metaphysics and the cosmological picture that I think would be healthier for us, but that's still a conversation, and I don't pretend to have all of the answers.
Yeah, and there's some aspect of it that I feel like has to be emergent and bottom up as well as some form of top down. And I have no idea what that looks like. And in a way, it has its own life. I think in culture when something catches on and it speaks to a need that's arising in in the collective. It does feel to me as well like our existing systems are running on a kind of, I wouldn't even say running on steam, but I would just say that they are like a self-perpetuating loop that is kind of blind and robotic. For example, our financial system, running on interest, it will just keep doing its thing, and they'll be like, oh my God, I'm in debt. Oh shit. And there's been all these different experiments even there with things like demurrage, where money loses value instead of gaining value. So you're incentivized to get rid of it. You're incentivized to spend it, And so I'm always interested in those, that's not necessarily a metaphysical shift, but in some ways you would need to have a different set of values to make that decision. It's like, should we hoard or should we let go? Is this money temporary, or is it something we need to grab? So it goes to quite a deep, I think, psycho-spiritual orientation. Which of those you prefer? Which of those feels better to you? That you're going to get more? So I'm also like weirdly optimistic, even though it's such a chaotic and crazy time, because that's where the new sort of arises. You mentioned, your particular orientation or interest in this area, and it feels like a good place to bring in Whitehead, because that's one of the people and process philosophy in general that I wanted to talk to you about, because I've never really done anything in depth on it, either during Rebel Wisdom or on Kainos, but so many of the people I've been in conversation with or been inspired by have some like Whiteheadian connection. Like there's Ian McGilchrist, there's yourself, there's a bunch more who kind of fit into that sphere. So maybe you could give people might have sort of heard of Whitehead, but not know much about him and his work. How would you describe it, sort of to someone on the bus who wasn't familiar with him?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how many people will drop Whitehead's name and maybe they'll mention fallacy of misplaced concreteness, or so I've heard Jordan Peterson repeat a Whitehead quote about the evolutionary use of intelligence, that you can make a mistake without being slaughtered by it, but very few people have gone on the perilous adventure of actually trying to read him. And so, I would say that Whitehead is one of the few philosophers in the 20th century who also had, I mean, he starts as a mathematician and a physicist. He had enough scientific background and understanding that he could begin to make metaphysical sense of the second scientific revolution that occurred in the early 20th century, relativity and quantum theories. And he was attempting to provide a new metaphysics for science to replace the mechanistic metaphysics that natural science was sort of founded with. You know, Descartes, Galileo, Newton, like these guys assumed a certain more or less deistic picture of the natural world, which is to say they considered God to be some sort of an engineer who imposed laws upon dead matter to get it to behave in a lawful, mathematically determined way. And you know that sparked this scientific revolution that tremendously enhanced and expanded human power and human understanding. But there were certain metaphysical assumptions that were built into that science itself undermined. You know, with Einstein's revolution, space and time are no longer absolute; they become relative. And then, in terms of our understanding of matter and energy, you know, quantum theory shows that matter can't really just be these simply located particles. There's non-local connections between every particle, every atom in the universe is or electron at least is entangled. And so Whitehead's looking at these scientific discoveries and saying, okay, we need a new metaphysics. And he thought, really, we can shift from a mechanistic metaphor, kind of master metaphor, to an organic one. And also, you know, it wasn't just in physics that this revolution, second scientific revolution, as I called it, was occurring. Also in biology with evolution. The true import of evolution by, you know, the middle of the 20th century, as some speculations about a possible, you know, expanding universe and this idea of cosmogenesis, something I think Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was among the earliest to formulate. It was becoming apparent already in Whitehead's time that evolution is not just a biological phenomenon. It's a general or cosmic process. And so Whitehead is a thinker who's trying to grapple with these new scientific discoveries, which are undermining, again, the metaphysics that science had been assuming, and requiring us to rethink the imaginative background informing scientific activity. And Whitehead develops a very sophisticated, some might even say Baroque, metaphysical scheme, a whole set of categories. But unlike earlier attempts at systematic metaphysics, he really did want his scheme of categories to be open-ended, to be radically empirical in the sense that he didn't want to start with a fixed set of categories and then force fit every experience into that set of categories. He really wanted the categories to be distilled from experience initially and then constantly sort of experimentally tested. And if some experience can't be interpreted by those categories, he would say, well, we need to adjust the categories then. There's not a problem with experience, there's a problem with our abstractions that, you know, through which we attempt to grapple with our experience. And he demonstrates that in his magnum opus, Process and Reality, about 250 pages in, having established this initial, you know, set of premises and categories. All of a sudden, on page 250, he abolishes one of the categories, and because he realizes, oops, don't need that one. It's already covered by this other category. Why would you leave that in the book unless you're trying to really demonstrate the open-ended methodology that you're employing here, which, you know, it's a different way of doing metaphysics than one might have been used to in a pre-scientific age. You know, he wants metaphysics to be experimental, in a sense. And so, you know, we could get into the details of what he's proposing as a process philosopher, But those are his basic motivations. That's the challenge he was trying to undertake, to shift science from a mechanistic metaphysics to an organic one, and to really understand nature as a, rather than a, a giant spatial container full of simply located bits of matter that move around and reconfigure. He wanted to reimagine nature as a time developmental process that's composed ultimately of events, or what he calls occasions, not matter and space, but a nexus of events, becomes the picture he's trying to articulate. So a lot of implications follow from that, but that's the basic picture.
Yeah, thank you. That's nicely summarized, and I know that, or I have a sense that obviously it's a massive, massive schema, way of thinking and material. So, one of the reasons I got back in touch to do this conversation is because of a concept you just mentioned, which is the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And one of the main ideas I've been playing with over the last maybe few years is the relationship between our direct experience and our abstractions, what we decide that experience is, how we make sense of it. And it seems to me that the internet in particular has, let's say it's not caused, but certainly enhanced a capacity that we already have to replace what we imagine for what we can verify through direct experience. So that can happen on a cultural level, it can happen on an individual level, and that seems important to me because the primacy of our direct experience feels like the most philosophically sound place to begin from. Obviously, we have to agree on that together in some way, because I can't just say, I'm seeing purple elephants right now, therefore purple elephants exist. But there is something of the relationship between our direct experience, our direct embodied experience, I'd say, and the ideas we have. Now, what was Whitehead's kind of take on that? What's the fallacy?
So, he first articulates this idea of a fallacy of misplaced concreteness in his 1925 book, Science and the Modern World, and he's tracing the consequences of dualism, basically, where, again, modern science begins with this more or less mechanistic or Cartesian metaphysics where, in order to simplify the scientific object of inquiry, nature, Descartes and Galileo, in his own way, had to separate out everything mental, separate out all the qualitative aspects of experience, to only focus on what Galileo called the primary qualities, what Descartes referred to as extension, which could be rendered mathematically or in geometrical terms, and then his brilliant, form of analytical geometry, where you can use algebra to manipulate relationships that are also geometrical. And so it's a really powerful method for measuring a certain abstract aspect of what we call nature, was developed, and was so successful that it fooled us into thinking it was giving us the whole picture of what nature is. And Whitehead critiques what he calls the bifurcation of nature, where what for Galileo was methodological. It's like, okay, we're gonna pretend like our experience could be severed into the measurable quantitative aspects and the qualitative aspects of our perception, color and taste and texture and all of that, and value and so on, so that we can more easily come to grips with, the easily measurable stuff. But then science advanced so much that we got to a point where materialists were trying to imagine how just the primary qualities of mass and extension and the things that could be geometrically modeled and measured and calculated, that somehow you could get the qualities and get perception and get consciousness out of just a rearrangement of the stuff that we were measuring, right? And so it's like there was a amnesia which occurred at some point, where science forgot that a methodological assumption was not a metaphysical reality, such that we'd get to this point where, with a mechanistic understanding of the brain, we're trying to figure out how consciousness could come out of that. And it's like, well, wait a minute. That mechanistic understanding is a model based on a methodological maneuver that from the beginning bracketed out consciousness. So you're never going to be able to find consciousness again in the abstraction that you've just, bracketed it out of. And so Whitehead wants to go back to that methodological maneuver and see if we can avoid that metaphysical mistake ultimately. And so concretely speaking, Whitehead would say the primary qualities are on the same footing as the secondary qualities, in the sense that what we think of as, say, mass, we only have a concept of mass because of our feelings, because we perceive pressure, we perceive pushes and pulls. There's an embodied basis for what the concept of mass or force or anything that physics wants to talk about in terms of transmission of energy. There's an embodied referent for it that allows us to make sense of it. Even if we can have such an abstract and numerically precise concept, ultimately we only know what we're talking about because it's rooted in our experience. It feels like something for my butt to be pressed against the seat, so I have some sense of what mass means. And yes, we can formalize that mathematically, but again, Whitehead's one of these weird physicists who thinks that we should be able to understand nature. You get people like Richard Feynman who didn't make this metaphysical correction that Whitehead makes in the early 20th century, saying that, look, give up trying to understand nature. Nature's totally irrational, doesn't make any sense. That's the consequence of quantum physics without a deeper metaphysics to really make it intuitive to us. You end up with Feynman saying nature's absurd. Literally, don't try to ask how nature, it doesn't make sense. Just shut up and calculate. Whitehead doesn't want to shut up and calculate. He wants to really root this back in our experience and overcome this fallacy of misplaced concreteness so that we don't continue to suffer from this amnesia. That we've removed mind from nature. We've removed the secondary qualities from a now mechanized nature. We did that. It's not like it wasn't that these aren't fused in our experience. Of course they are. So let's return to our experience and then see how we can get science out of our concrete experience, knowingly doing abstraction, but how can we not neglect the methodological procedure, right, and not try to feel like we could derive mind from an abstraction, from an abstract geometrical model. You're never going to be able to do that. The only reason there's a geometrical model is because there's a mind apprehending it, right? And so I think the fallacy of misplaced concreteness is probably the best way into Whitehead, because if you don't get what he's doing there, then the introduction of panpsychist ideas about prehension and feeling permeating the entire universe all the way down to the level of photons and whatnot, that might not make any sense unless you've seen the motivation for that whole maneuver.
Yeah, thank you for laying that out. And I agree wholeheartedly with his position there. And one of the reasons I'm interested in it is I'm constantly trying to find the simplest way to explain ideas that I think have import for how we build civilization, how we live with each other, how we live in harmony with the earth. And unfortunately, most of those ideas are incredibly complex, so it's always a journey. I was reading Jürgen Habermas the other day, and my nephew, we were looking after my 7-year-old nephew, and as I was reading it, he was playing his Switch on the couch. I was next to him and I was reading it, and I was like, man, this is super interesting. It's so dense. And I was kind of pausing and taking notes, and I thought, how would I explain this to him? Sort of dense German sociology. And it was actually a very good exercise because it got me some interesting places. But there's something about the fallacy of misplaced concreteness and everything you were just laying out, which to me feels very promising, because it's very, very difficult to make the claim for anyone, even if they're not interested in philosophy, that there's such a thing as that you can kind of create that abstractions live first, and then the body sort of is like a secondary, or the body and consciousness are sort of like secondary qualities thereof. Because if there's no body, as you pointed out, if Descartes had no body and couldn't breathe, we wouldn't know of his ideas. He wouldn't have had ideas because he wouldn't have had a biological, body through which those could be mediated, I would say. So it's kind of twee and a bit overly simplistic, but at the same time, it is a bit of a kind of stumper for, okay, well, embodiment is, in my view, in some sense, more concrete, right? Like the fact that we are embodied here, living, feeling, breathing, experiencing, that's concrete. I don't think abstractions are not concrete. I just think they are, let's say, bound to that embodiment. Is there maybe something to expand out of that, or would you agree with that kind of general premise?
Yeah, I mean, one way of getting at this is just to remember that science has certain conditions of possibility, right? One of thinking itself has certain conditions of possibility. One of them is that you are a living body. I mean, so far as we know, maybe there are angels without bodies that think, perhaps. As far as we know, in our human experience, bodies, living bodies, indeed healthy, well-fed bodies are necessary for clear thinking. And, in the background of Descartes' meditations, that's quite apparent. I mean, he had to be warm. It was winter. He was in a gown, warmed by the fire, and he's giving you the picture of his embodied situation that allowed him to perform this very abstract, ethereal, cognitive exercise of, where he's doubting all of his sensory experience. He had to be really comfortable. If he was really cold, I think he might have had more trouble doubting his sensory experience. So yeah, all that's sort of implicit. There's a way of reading Descartes where this is all obvious, and he's not even really denying it. It's just that we take the results of his procedure and forget the procedure, where embodiment played an important role. But so science has certain preconditions. Science is obviously it's a human activity, but it's also a cultural activity. And so I think a civilization that imagines that science could explain culture by reduction to something pre-cultural or non-cultural, or just the motion of meaningless matter or something, it's a very confused civilization, because there's a mixing up of what's primary and what's derivative there. I mean, science cannot proceed to try to find regularities in nature without a whole set of presuppositions, like that language is meaningful, like that we are conscious agents capable of performing experiments on purpose because we think we might discover something. So Whitehead jokes that scientists, this is a quote, "Scientists animated by the purpose of proving that they are purposeless constitute an interesting subject for study." And so, if we're not conscious agents, the whole enterprise of science is impossible, right? And so, for science in a materialistic way to go about trying to explain away consciousness as nothing but a brain mechanism that can be itself reduced to the outcome of a blind process of natural selection, I think it undermines, again, the conditions that make science possible. Nature is intelligible. Human beings are intelligent. I don't think you can, in a materialistic picture, adequately ground the possibility of there even being something like science. Does that make sense, or am I being
Yeah,
too...
absolutely. Yeah, and I'm actually just thinking of Nicholas Langlitz's book Neuropsychedelia, which is really exactly that premise. He researched scientists in a psychedelic lab as the subjects. It's kind of an anthropological study on them, and it's very interesting because he points out that a lot of the time they are speaking from a position or behaving from a position of believing that they don't have free will, believing that they are just effectively brain processes, and that's all their consciousness, and all by extension, that's all they are, who they are as people. However, when things got serious, like a serious life event or something that was more emotionally deep, the language stopped and it became more normal. Like, I feel sad, or I want this. So I think there is an interesting conceit underlying the scientific, let's say scientific culture, because science has its own cultures and subcultures and ways of doing things. And so, yeah, and the other thing that I was thinking as you were sharing that is, one thing I think is under examined in general, not just in the history of science, but in general, is the effect that different states of consciousness have on sense making, on discovery, on perspective. What would it have been like if Descartes were taking a lot of MDMA when he was writing his philosophies? And in some sense, we can look at religious history and go, well, we kind of know what it's like when people are having deep prophetic or mystical experiences, and the kind of insights that they're sharing from that space. And those are perhaps some of the most profound and world-changing. But equally, a lot of scientists are quite visionary. Like Einstein's insights came from what sound very much like some form of visionary or deep, certainly not normal waking consciousness, right? So I think there's this overlap, which is also often forgotten, that a lot of physicists are they're not so far from mystics. They have this kind of incredible visionary quality to them.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, even in defense of Descartes a little bit, a lot of his philosophical motivations stemmed from visionary dreams that he had, and he, not unlike Newton, who I think it's true, he wrote more about alchemy and astrology than he did about mathematical physics. But Descartes was searching for the Rosicrucian order, and which was the secret society that he thought held some important truth that he would like to be initiated into, and he couldn't find them, or they were hiding from him, and I've read the name of the theorist, a French historian, who thinks that it's highly likely that Descartes was smoking spliffs, basically. It would have been tobacco, it would have been hashish when he was a soldier in the 30 Years' War in the early 1600s, because that was something that the soldiers were doing. And so he may have at least gotten stoned. But yeah, under the influence of MDMA, I doubt he would have been, just looking out his window, imagining people as automatons. It might have been a little bit more empathy. But I think William James was the one who, in the 1880s, 1890s, he tries nitrous oxide and really shifts his philosophical perspective, and he realizes that our mode of consciousness is world disclosing. And so shift your consciousness, and all of a sudden a different world manifests itself. And there's that famous quote from him about we cannot close accounts with reality until we have explored these other states of consciousness. And and so in terms of the recovery of psychedelic practice and psychedelic medicines, chemicals, entheogens, whatever we want to call them, there isn't just, often it's the mental health application or the spiritual implications that get most of the press, but I think there's also something to be said for scientific and philosophical inquiry being supercharged, through these types of mind-altering substances, and that's been true through the 20th century. A lot of important discoveries have occurred. It's not just great music that came out of psychedelic experimentation, but some really important scientific breakthroughs. So that, I suspect, will continue, and it may be part of just the more openness to psychedelics has led more people to try them, who are more buttoned up, and academics, scientists, philosophers, and that might be part of what's maybe it's part of what's driving this shift into idealism and panpsychism.
Yeah, I mean, there's evidence for that. Some evidence. Chris Timmerman did a study on, that psychedelic experiences tend to move people towards a more panpsychist position, and also more dualistic position. I think he also said that can often happen, unless they're very staunch materialists to begin with, in which
Right.
case they didn't really shift. But I think that's about rigidity, in my opinion. Obviously, I'm biased, but I think that might be about rigidity. And I imagine you could equally yeah, I think that rigidity you could find a very panpsychically oriented person who's very rigid in another way and it wouldn't shift, politically, say, in some way. Yeah, and I know a quick shout out to Bruce Damer and Minds, because that's exactly what they're doing. And Bruce is, one of the latest scientists in the line of people who've made major discoveries with the help, not just of psychedelics, but also breath work. It was kind of a combination.
Yep.
And
I'll be
so
with
that,
Bruce
yeah.
in a couple of weeks. I don't know when this will be released, but middle of September, Bruce and I will be in Aspen together
Lovely.
to talk about visionary science and how he developed aspects of his theory of the origin of life as a result of that type of experience, being able to really drop himself into the primordial pool where the first protocells emerged. Like he literally, it's a participatory visionary science that he's doing. Yeah, just as an example of what's possible.
Yeah, it's an exciting one, and in fact, on the Kainos Substack, if people delve in, maybe I'll put a link in this one. I did a conversation with Bruce probably about like a year and a half ago about that, where he lays out the whole story, which, if people are interested, is
Nice.
absolutely mind blowing and worth checking out. So Matt, in our sort of like last 10 minutes or so, it'd be interesting to hear like what are you feeling most excited about philosophically at the moment? Like what are you working on? What are you what have you got your teeth in?
Well, I'll try to articulate this in a way that is meaningful to normal people, but it's a deep metaphysical issue that I've been chewing on with my friend, another biologist, Timothy Jackson, evolutionary biologist. And folks familiar with my stuff will know I've probably done 30 or 40 podcasts with Tim over the last couple of years. And he's a biologist, right? I'm a speculative philosopher, and we're trying to understand what are the core principles you need to get an evolutionary cosmos going. And this might seem abstract, but I think people can get a feel for what he and I are kind of intention around. He wants to say that all of the order of the universe emerges out of what he'll call pure variation, which is to say, at the bottom of everything is just this the technical term would be a kind of metastable field of potentials. And there's a kind of symmetry break, and then you get the emergence of order out of that, where there was no predefined blueprint or anything like that, right? And as far as it goes, like I don't want a universe where, like the deist picture that Newton had, where God has a plan in advance, and then from the outside sort of shapes matter to obey the plan. But because I'm a Whiteheadian, and Whitehead has this picture, I mean, he has a theology, he has a picture of God, and he has a sort of reformed concept of Platonic ideas that are eternal. And, Tim's very uncomfortable with this idea, but from my point of view, you can't just have a universe coming out of pure variation. You need something invariant there also. Otherwise, how do you even... It's hard to define variation without its opposite, something invariant, something eternal. So we're always in this situation of needing to think polarities, right? And so for me, variation and something invariant, say in Whitehead's terms, I'll just use his terminology for a second. There's a realm of eternal objects, which are just these pure potentials, and the role that God plays for Whitehead is not determining what actually occurs, but God values the realm of potentials and gives, in that sense, some order to the space of possibility that then informs what actually happens without determining it by giving, say each moment of our experience, we have some sense of what possibilities would be better or worse to realize next. And Whitehead thinks we have to explain where that intuition of better and worse comes from. And so he, I think, has this other principle in addition to variation, which for Whitehead, that's kind of like creativity. It's his ultimate category. It's just ongoing, overflowing possibility with no direction. But then for him, you need this divine process of valuation that says, this would be best, this is good, this is beautiful, and this is what the infinite ideal of beauty would be, that then gives that process, that creative process, that pure variation, a vector that we then, as finite creatures, can respond to. And so this is, in a sense, a perennial issue, and Tim is not a materialist. Well, he's not a mechanist. He thinks that, in some sense, pure variation is what he would say materiality is. He's a kind of animistic materialist, maybe. Tim's going to listen to this later, and he'll probably have nuance. Of course, he'll have nuances.
You can do 5 more podcasts together to unpack this.
Yeah, but I'm not willing to just let go of all of these old sort of traditional Platonic tropes. I think Plato struck a pretty good balance when it comes to the relationship between what he called the nous, or the intellect, or this realm of forms, and then what he called the chora, this Greek term for, it can be translated in many ways, receptacle, or kind of the matrix, the space in which things can come to be. And so, like, how do you give the forms embodiment? Well, you need to bring the abstraction and the matrix of becoming into some intimate marriage and relationship. And I feel like Plato's describing that, whereas Tim, as a biologist, is way more hesitant to acknowledge anything like an eternal form or an eternal object. And so this might not be exciting to other people, but I think it has a lot of implications culturally, it has a lot of implications scientifically. And so I'm trying to, what's exciting me right now is the ways in which I'm finding Plato, let's say, and let's say his cosmological dialogue, the Timaeus, but all of his dialogues, still almost 2,500 years later, continues to be, I think, quite relevant and important for where we go next. And it's not just that it could be that we don't just need a totally new cosmology, that actually there's a lot that's already here with us, implicit, that we've inherited, that we can recover. That, so much of modernity is about, this revolutionary break with the past, and let's just start new, blank slate. That was never really possible. Modernity borrows so many of its values from the ancient world and the medieval world. It's just eliding that and pretending like it's made up all of its values whole cloth from empirical principles or whatever, but that's never really been true. And so maybe what we need is not a new paradigm revolution, like that's the same modern mistake, but really, how can we recover and integrate the wisdom that's already available to us, what John Vervaeke would call the cultural grammar, this Neoplatonic cultural grammar that's not just Western, it's the whole Islamic world is also rooted in this same Platonic grammar. And so, yeah, I'm excited about the novelty that might come from the recovery of what we've just been kind of neglecting or not interpreting in as living a way as we might.
Awesome. Yeah, I was thinking of John just there as well. I had a conversation with him recently where he said which actually we put out recently a few weeks ago, where he, he made that point again about like, find the cultural grammar closest to your own as a starting point. It's not necessarily the end point of reclaiming some connection to the sacred and reclaiming a new cosmology, but like starting there, which I think is pretty solid advice, and yeah, I mean, I would agree with you in the sense, philosophically, I agree that to have any kind of invariance, variance, you need invariance. You need, you need chaos and order. And, I just wrote a piece about the Gnostic myth and why it's applicable or the Gnostic creation myth with Sophia and the demiurge, and why it's applicable.
I read it last night. I loved it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah. And so, I see echoes of that as well, where you have this kind of, pleroma, fullness of this kind of non-dual everythingness. And then there's this kind of split from that. And I didn't talk about it in the piece very much because it would have just been very long, but, some interpretations say that really her other half is Christos, right? So the Sophia and Christos, she's with an eon, and, they come in these like male, female dyads roughly. But some interpretations see like the Christos as that ordering force, the logos. Like, why do you desire a particular thing above another thing? Why does one thing happen instead of everything happening all the time at once, right? And there is something very profound in that, and the fact that it recurs in so many mythologies around the world, I think, suggests that, maybe there's something going on there. Maybe there's an innate understanding that, the Taoists certainly have, that these things are mutually arising and imply one another. So I certainly think that goes all the way. It's turtles all the way down in my cosmology, but beneath the turtles, it's that kind of union of opposites. I think, yeah, that's always felt for me very intuitive and consistent across. I like things that are consistent across different cultures and different mystical traditions and mystical experiences. I think that's a very interesting place to start.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many versions of that Gnostic myth, but the basic structure, as I understand it, that I find really helpful, and it's an important correction to that deism that I've been criticizing this whole conversation. Where in the deistic picture, it's like there's like a plan in advance, so it's as if creation starts with the logos, and then it just unfolds according to the blueprint. But this Gnostic myth of Sophia, it's like, no, creation begins with a kind of yearning for more intimate relationship. No plan, just yearning for that connection. And that leads to a kind of fracturing, because when you're just undifferentiated oneness, there is no possibility of relationship. So you need to break into pieces in a way. And then the logos, rather than being the plan in advance, is more like the rescue mission. That's like this implicit. It's an ordering principle, but it's working incarnationally to help remind the shards that have become fractured that actually they share an origin. But it's a more dynamic role for logos to play than just being, the big man in the sky in advance who knows how it's going to end already. It's a more balanced picture of, in a way, like the masculine feminine dynamic writ large, like cosmologically. It gives the feminine pride of place in a way.
Which it has biologically in many ways too, right? So it's kind of in line with that. Yeah.
The Gnostics are, the whole picture is very embryological. And so they're looking at, in a way, and whether this was conscious or not, I'm not trying to reduce the mythic to just the biological. It's not like myth is just primitive science, but at some level, whether consciously or not, they're recapitulating the creation story of each individual human being at a cosmological scale, right? And so the process of the development of the universe is akin to the moment of fertilization and embryological development of an individual human being, so, and there must be some deeper parallel here, just even scientifically. I think we've had too fragmented a picture of the universe that we think that biological embryogenesis could have nothing to do with cosmogenesis. Like, they're totally disconnected. How could they actually be disconnected? Like, we need to think in a more integrated relational way to get what the Gnostics are up to, I think.
I love that. I haven't thought about it in those terms, but you're absolutely right. Now that's going to be my quest now to kind of explore that as a frame. Because I think you're absolutely right, and there's something very profound in that. Yeah, wow, awesome, Matt. Thank you. This has, as always, been incredibly enjoyable.
Yeah, it's always. I mean, it's evening for you, but always fun to do metaphysics in the morning for me over in California. So,
Awesome, cool. Well, speak soon.
all right, Holly, take
Stay
care.
on because